At the heart of Capri's budget breakdown is our commitment to promoting transparency and enhancing national engagement in policy decision-making. We firmly believe that informed and engaged citizens are central pillars of a healthy and functional and vibrant democracy. By evaluating the government's fiscal plans in an accessible public manner like we're doing tonight, we hope to enhance public participation in public policy decision-making and in turn, improve public policy here in Jamaica. As aptly put by the authors of the report, with greater public insight and involvement, the government will be better positioned to make a budget that truly reflects the needs and wants of those who finance it, the people of Jamaica. This year's budget breakdown actually holds particular personal significance for me, as I proudly became a citizen of Jamaica last week. Thank you. So when the minister arrives, we got to arrive him that he has one more citizen who is very, very eager to know where their taxpayer dollars are going to. So we, the Jamaican people, young and old, citizens by birth and citizens through descent, are engaged. And we care about how our country is being managed, especially when we get the opportunity to hear about it directly from the source. We are invested in our country's affairs, and we care about what's going on. And I'm sorry, as a new Jamaican citizen, we care about Wagwan. So my role here this evening is to tell you how the night is going to proceed. First, we will play a short video for you to learn a little bit more about Capri, the work that we do as an organization, and who we are. We'll then hear from Dr. Damian King, who's Capri's executive director, who will deliver a brief presentation about the report, which was co-authored by Dr. King and Capri economics researcher Priya Alexander. Following Dr. King's presentation, we will move into an armchair discussion between Dr. King and Minister Clark about the content of the report. And we also want to hear from you, our audience, and encourage you to participate in the discussion by submitting questions online using Slido. So Slido is an online platform that allows you to post or upvote questions that you'd like the minister or Dr. King to respond to here live. To do so, you'll visit www.slido.com and enter event code Capri, that's C-A-P-R-I. And if you missed those instructions, no worries, we'll repeat them again throughout the night.
Born from the recognition that policymakers do not have access to the technical capacity and knowledge from within government to properly inform their decision-making, Capri was formed to fill that gap, to provide the evidence-based information that a minister, permanent secretary, or other decision-maker would need to make an informed policy choice. The Caribbean Policy Research Institute, Capri, is an independent, not-for-profit public policy think tank based at the University of the West Indies, Mona. Capri has dedicated the last 17 years to the production and dissemination of impartial, evidence-informed, applied public policy research and knowledge to inform policy decisions on the economy, social issues, the environment, and governance. Capri's mission, therefore, is to provide quality research in an accessible manner to policymakers, their constituents, stakeholders, and the general public to inform a constructive debate around critical social, economic, and developmental issues facing the region.
A Caribbean Policy Research 2023 report.
According to the Caribbean Policy Research Institute,
the Caribbean Policy Research Institute,
and frankly, I must say to Capri, big up on yourself.
We have impact. Capri's impact is due to the use of established methodologies, rigorously applied and evidence-driven findings that are clearly and engagingly communicated. Once the research and analysis are completed, in our effort to ensure that all stakeholders benefit from our information, it is disseminated through multiple knowledge products and media channels, traditional and social. In 2017, we launched our first formal review of the government's fiscal budget called Money Talks. What does the new budget really tell you? This signaled the start of a staple knowledge product that would be expected by policymakers, stakeholders, and the concerned Jamaican.
The government's budget represents what it has chosen to do with your money, the money it has taken from you. And these are actual choices between, say, whether the government is prioritizing security or roads. How those priorities are changing is implicit in the budget. They are not always obvious. So Capri's budget breakdown is an exercise where we extract how those priorities are changing and expose them to you so that you're able to hold your government to account.
Our previous budget review, Budget Breakdown 2023, produced 3 recommendations, the most noteworthy of which was an increase in the income tax threshold. Invited panelists, the Minister of Finance and the Public Service, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark, agreed to consider revising the threshold.
This is one of the most popular questions. I've said publicly it's something that we'd look at, and I'd be very sort of transparent about it. Raising the threshold by the amounts that are sort of proposed in the report, would be a very expensive undertaking. You'll recall that when the threshold was raised to 1.5 in over 2 financial years, 2017 and 2018, I believe it was, or 2016 and 2017 and 2018, it cost 2% of GDP. We had to split it over 2 years, and ultimately it had to be done on a revenue neutral basis because you couldn't plug a whole of 2% of GDP into the fiscal accounts. So moving back, I'm not saying that what you have here is 2% of GDP, but that's a big number.
At the tabling of the 2024 National Expenditure Budget, Dr. Clark announced an increase to the income tax threshold from 1.5 million to 1.7 million. Customs duties increased from US $500 to US $1,000 for cargo and US $50 to $100 for personal items. GCT was removed from fruits and vegetables, no guarantors required for SLB loans, and an additional 4,200 grants of $60,000 each made available to low-income applicants. A $120 million was also allocated to the rehabilitation of entertainment zones. An additional 2,046 pensioners will receive more disposable income through increases in the pension exemption and age relief exemptions. And finally, no new taxes. We now hand over to Capri's Executive Director, Dr. Damian King, to present the findings of our latest publication, Budget Breakdown 2024, an analysis of the government's proposed revenue and expenditure.
The budget that was tabled in Parliament is to be believed, and there are a lot of reasons to believe it. Then we are now at an important point in Jamaica's economic history. Based on that budget, the measure of our debt, the debt to GDP ratio, which currently is around 74%, is programmed to fall to 64% of GDP. To show you how significant this is, I want to look at when was the last time Jamaica had a debt to GDP ratio of 64%. So let's follow the red line. Almost, but not quite. Some of you weren't born yet. (1976), almost 50 years ago. We are going to get to the lowest amount of public debt in almost 50 years. This is a significant moment in the country's economic history. And it is the background to our analysis of the budget. This is what 12 years now of fiscal reform and management has taken us to. Before we get into the headlines that I want to pull out of this budget, let me just spend a minute on one aspect of the methodology we apply. It's not legitimate to compare budget numbers from a past year to budget numbers for this year because, as you will appreciate, because of inflation, the purchasing power of money changes. So when we compare some number from 2018 to a corresponding number for the same category in 2024, we are comparing monies of different value. What a dollar bought in 2018 was a lot more than it buys in 2024. So we adjust all past values for inflation, and here's how we do it. If we know that, on average, prices have gone up by, say, 40% between 2018 and 2024, then it means that the expenditure that took place for that category, or the revenue for a category that might have been $550 million in 2018, it will take 40% more to buy the same amount of goods and services, to procure the same amount. And so we inflate that 2018 figure by 40%. And in doing so, then we don't look at the original amount spent in 2018. We compare the current figure to what that same procurement would cost now. So all of the amounts that we quote and we cite in this presentation have been adjusted for inflation. So there are three key trends that I want to talk about. Losers and winners. What's up and what's down? Who is getting more and where is it coming from? Then the trend in overall tax revenue. Really one of the most significant trends in the budget. And then we look at what is happening to the mix of the sources of taxation. So we start with looking at what is up and what is down. So here's how we do this. We compare to the outturn for 2023-2024, last fiscal year, and we looked at what new resources the minister has available. And this accounts for about a fifth of the budget. So the amounts are significant. According to his presentation, he has about, again adjusted for inflation, about $80 billion more that come from use of funds that he has drawn down from the IMF resilience facility, as well as the sale of government receivables. The second bucket is the projected increase in revenue, inflation adjusted, of about $70 billion. And the third bucket is reductions in the inflation adjusted allocations to other categories of expenditure. These three categories that in purchasing power terms are being allocated less than it turned out they got last year are security. And this is the inflation-adjusted trend over the last 7 years. And you can see, notwithstanding the pandemic where everything went down, it basically has been an increase except for what the new budget projects, which is constant in nominal terms, but again, because of inflation, is going to buy a bit less. Social services, again, an overall upward trend, and down by about 6% as far as the new budget is concerned. And the allocation to the economy, infrastructure, and so on, again, apart from during the pandemic, an upward trend being cut back this year. So those cutbacks are to be seen, well, one, as maybe a correction to the increase in spending that has been taking place in recent years, but also, when you disaggregate the figures, all three functional categories benefited from one-off capital expenditure and equipment purchases in the last fiscal year. So those were never intended to be continued every year. So that's the context for these spending cutbacks. What does the budget say the minister is going to do with nearly $190 billion? Well, most of it is going to increase the allocation to reducing public debt. Now, this is a net amount. This is not gross amortization, paying down the principal on public debt. It is net of new loan receipts and also compared to last year. So we can see it as more aggressive reduction in the public debt. One of the topics that we're going to talk about when he joins me on the platform. And the rest of it is an allocation to the administration functional category, a large part of which is to fund the public sector salary reform that resulted in newsmaking salary increases. If we look at the trend for that functional category, we see this is the only functional category where, in inflation-adjusted terms, it received less for 5 years and has now, I guess, gotten its turn at drawing from public revenue. So that's those are the losers and winners. The second headline, I think, to come out of this budget, when we dig into it, is actually quite remarkable. Adjusted for inflation, government revenue has gone from the equivalent of $842 billion to, for the new budget, nearly 1 trillion Jamaican dollars. The government, dollars are on. Up to last year, that's a 16% increase. And in the new budget, revenue is up 7%, is projected to be up 7%. Here's another view of the same thing. The revenue, the tax revenue to GDP ratio, which, when his administration took office, was 25% of GDP and is now 32% of GDP. This is an important number. Some of you will look at that and say, this is not good. We are being overtaxed. Here's the context in which you are to interpret this. The average tax to GDP ratio in Africa is 16%. In Central America, it's 19%. In the Caribbean, it's 22%. In the European Union, It's 41%. There's a correlation between how well a country is run and their tax to GDP ratio. If you're an economist, to use that cliche that we hate, this is the right direction. The capacity of a government to fund public goods and services is a measure of success. But it raises some questions. Why is revenue going up? The minister thumps the table in Parliament every year and says no new taxes. So we would like to know, where is this money coming from? Let's look at the possibilities. One possibility is economic growth. That more economic activity, and you extract a constant share of that, then you're going to get more revenue. But that's not the answer, because as we showed on the last chart, it's the tax to GDP ratio that is going up. In other words, revenue is going up faster than GDP. Well, it's inflation. Prices go up. So again, the government is getting more in nominal terms. But no, because when we showed the increase in revenue, we have adjusted that for inflation. So it's going up in real terms. Well, you know, everybody's excuse for data they don't want to believe is it's the informal economy. We dump everything, all explanations into the informal economy. Informal activity, illegal activity, tax evasion. So this, I mean, it's possible, but however large the informal economy is, both in actuality and as an excuse, it's highly unlikely that activity in the informal and illegal economy is moving in a different direction by significant amounts from the measured economy. So maybe this is part of the explanation, but it will not be a significant part of the explanation. And that leaves us with the income tax threshold, which I promised in the introduction we're going to talk about. So the income tax threshold, for those unfamiliar, is the level of income, annual income, below which income taxes are not applied. It was 1.5 million for the last 6 years and is programmed to go to 1.7 million in the new budget. Above that level of annual income, taxes applied. Standard rate is 25%. Let's do the inflation adjustment. 1.5 million when it was introduced annually in purchasing power equivalent, even after the increase to 1.7 million, is only buying 1.1 million of what 1.5 million bought 7 years ago. Let me bring it down a little more. Let's talk about it in terms of meal deals. If you were to spend, if you earned 1.5 million a year, and you were to spend the entire 1.5 million at KFC, and if you have been to any of the KFCs in Jamaica and you have seen the lines, this is apparently what some people do. That would mean that daily, in 2017 when the threshold was set, you would have been able to buy 7 meal deals a day. Your salary would buy 7 meal deals every day. Because the threshold has not been adjusted with inflation and is now getting an increase only to 1.7 million, then in 2024, that 1.5 million is only going to buy 4 meal deals a day without paying taxes, even after the adjustment to 1.7. And the other 3 meal deals that you normally buy, well, taxes are coming out of that. So it represents taxing people at a level of income that were not paying income tax 7 years ago. But this is the policy. So there has been significant growth in revenue, however you measure it. And a part of that growth in revenue, a part of that growth is due to the real reduction in the income tax threshold. One of the questions that we'd like to ask is, and we have seen now that all functional categories have benefited with administration and public sector salaries almost just catching up. All functional categories have benefited from the revenue bonanza. But it's projected to continue. So we collectively need to discuss with the minister and the Jamaican public, where do we want this to go? That's one of the questions we need to answer as a society. The last headline that we extracted from the budget is the tax mix. So there are 4 ways that governments get revenue. Taxes on income, both personal income and corporate income. Taxes on production and consumption, like GCT. Taxes on international trade, and grants and fees. I want to call your attention to this one. Taxes on income. That accounted for 23% of revenue 7 years ago. It now accounts for 31%. Taxes on income, what are called direct taxes versus indirect taxes. Taxes on income used to be just under a quarter of total revenue. Now it is just under a third. So this too is a policy choice, to shift the source of taxation towards direct taxation of individuals and corporations, away from indirect taxation of their economic activities. Is this something that we want and we would like to see continue? But there's a problem with direct taxation. There's a problem with income taxes. Well, there are problems with income taxes, and they all have to do with tax evasion. Income taxes are too easy to evade. And so they are inefficient. If you take $1 of expected revenue from import duties, taxes on international trade, or GCT, a tax on production and consumption, versus that same $1 of expected revenue from income taxes, you're going to get fewer cents. You're going to get less revenue from income taxes because income taxes are more widely evaded. They are more easily evaded. So it's an inefficient tax. It's also more costly to collect. So by increasing the share of revenue you're getting from income taxes, you're reducing the efficiency of your tax system and the integrity of your tax system. Second problem, inequity. When you look at only the persons who are formally employed and on PAYE, then income taxes are equitable. They are equitable because since there's a threshold, the more income you earn is the higher the share of income tax you pay. And that's something we would like to have. It's called progressive taxation. But if you look at not just the people who are formally employed and on PAYE, but if you look at the entire labor force, then income tax becomes inequitable. Because the more than half of the population, the labor force, that is not on PAYE, are paying either none or very little income taxes because they're outside of the PAYE system. And then you get what is called horizontal inequity, that people earning the same level of income are paying vastly different amounts in tax depending on whether they are formally employed and on PAYE or are professionals working in Magoti on their own. And I use that example not to be facetious, but just to make the point that people who are outside of the tax system, PAYE system, are not only people, who are hustlers selling flowers at the street, at the stop sign. Many persons at high levels of income are outside of the PAYE system. And even if they are partially on the PAYE system, then income they are earning outside of that doesn't get reflected. So there are equity issues, serious equity issues with income tax. The third problem with income tax is that it incentivizes informality. We talk a lot about the informal economy, but we talk about the informal economy in the same way we talk about the Blue Mountain Range, that we were born and we see it and it exists. It's a natural phenomenon. But the informal economy is an economic outcome. It's a choice that people make to be formal or not. And it's a choice that businesses make to employ people formally or not. And so the more you depend on income taxes is the more you're incentivizing the economy to be informal. This is not a moral problem. Economists don't care about morality. This is a productivity problem because informal activity is less productive than formal activity. So you are lowering the national average productivity by incentivizing informality. Resources are used up evading the formal system and in remaining at a small enough scale not to be picked up by the formal system. So our takeaways from our in-depth analysis of the budget in the context of the trends of the last several years are, first, we need to appreciate how far we have come. And again, to put it in context, this low debt is not a nice statistic. It's not a badge. It's the resilience of a small, vulnerable country. We're going to talk about that with the minister and talk about why this is so important. Second, revenue in real terms, in relative terms, has grown significantly and is likely going to continue growing. What are we going to do with this new money? And finally, there is an increasing reliance on income taxes. And is that a choice we collectively want to make? Out of all of this come two recommendations, which you can anticipate from the foregoing discussion. The first one, which we made last year, is to shift away from direct taxes, to raise the income tax threshold, to basically correct what we see as the disadvantages of income tax. And secondly, in that debate about where do we put rising incomes, we think there's a case to be made that it should be put increasingly towards the social safety net. To build a path to spend more on public transportation, to spend more on public health facilities, to balance the inequality that we always struggle with in Jamaica. And with that, I'm going to invite the Honourable Minister for a discussion. Thank you. So, Minister, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So here's where I'd like to start. As much as we have had increased revenue leading up and the trend over the last 6 years, the projection in the new budget compared to what was received last year is a significant jump. So what is it that gives you the confidence that that revenue projection is going to be achieved?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me, and good evening to all of your participants here physically and those who are joining online. You talk about revenue increases passively, as if this somehow magically happens in the ether. And I don't think you give enough. Revenues don't just happen. They happen because policies are such that they can accommodate increase in revenues. Don't forget, one of the first moves I made in the very first budget I delivered was to completely eradicate a number of nuisance taxes. Got rid of the minimum business tax, got rid of the asset tax for non-financial businesses, took away stamp duty on financial transactions and real estate transactions, and completely obliterated transfer tax, okay? That was fiscal policy at work that unleashed an energy that was always here, but was trapped. Okay, so revenues exist in a context and have responded to an environment. Even in COVID, we had more companies being formed in Jamaica than ever before because the burdens placed on new companies were removed. So just to address the passivity, right? It's not a passive exercise. It's not that you have any policy mix and this is going to happen. This is a response to the policy mix that we have deliberately put in place. Now, your question is about revenues for 24-25. Okay, so the business of revenue projection is not a science. It's more of an art than science, right? As you know. Revenue projections involve an assessment of the macro framework, which includes the outlook for economic growth, the outlook for inflation, and what is happening at a micro level in some of the different tax types. Over the past several years, we have seen where revenue has overperformed our budget. Yeah? This year ended March of 2024 is an exception to the last several years. We might have had an instance in 2023 as well. But by and large, over the past, let's say, 8 years, it's been a minority of times. With the outcome in March, the one area definitely that we have to examine is the underperformance of corporate income tax. Remember, in the outcomes to March, I'm talking for the full year, for the full 12 months, all other tax types, or most of the significant tax types, overperformed budget and overperformed the previous year. I'll give you just two examples. PAYE was up 25% against the previous year. GCT was up 21% against the previous year, but corporate income tax was essentially flat. It was up 0.8% against the previous year. So if there's anything that gives me pause for the projections in the current fiscal year, it would be the outcome for corporate income tax that came out of the March data. As I have mentioned elsewhere, we don't want to have a knee-jerk reaction. TAJ reported that a number of entities would have declared a liability but did not pay in time, and a larger proportion than before. We have to see what that results in the months of April, May, and possibly June before making any definitive moves or commitments. Suffice to say that if we do have to make adjustments, we have flexibility, adjustments including a downward revision of revenue, we have flexibility in that there are untapped sources of revenue that don't place additional burdens on taxpayers that exist, and there are possibilities to adjust expenditure without affecting priority programs. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks very much. But while we're on the subject of revenue, let's go to one of the major issues that is raised in our report, Budget Breakdown 2024, and that I highlighted in the presentation, which is the increasing reliance on income taxes and the problem of income taxes, in particular, in the specific social circumstances and economic structure of Jamaica. And because of its inefficiency, because it incentivizes informality, because it has a level of horizontal inequity, and you addressed your thinking in the presentation to Parliament. So let's hear the counter-argument.
Sure. No, the points that you make are valid points, but let me just put some stuff in context. When you look over the entire period of this administration from 2016 to 2024, what we've seen is that GDP has doubled from about 1.7 trillion to about 3.29 trillion, okay? And along with the doubling of GCT, we have seen, of GDP, we have seen GCT also double from approximately 100, and here in nominal terms, from 151 billion to 300 billion. And we've seen personal income tax do a little bit more than double from 136 billion to 320 something billion, about an increase of 136%. I say that to say that the increase in income tax revenue in PAYE is consistent with the increase in nominal GDP, increase in GCT. It's not as if it is a massive outlier. But the points that you make about efficiency and about equity are points that I think are valid. They're very valid points. However, what is not addressed is how to do it, because you can do it in a way that introduces other factors that are problematic. For instance, if you were to adjust the threshold in a non-revenue neutral way, then you have to think about equity from another point of view. Because the fact remains that the proportion of persons in the tax database who are under, let's use 1.5 for the time being, who were under the 1.5 income tax threshold as a total proportion of the persons in the income tax threshold, you're talking about a number, and I said it in my budget presentation, of 75 to 80%. No, it doesn't mean that everybody below 1.5, that is their total earnings. Some people might earn tips and so on, and that doesn't come into it, but the reported earnings, okay? You have 70 to 75% of persons below the income tax threshold.
Who are on PAYE.
Who are on PAYE, okay? So if you were to engage in a non-revenue neutral, what that would be equivalent to would be to taking up that pool of money and giving it to a small proportion of the population.
Who are relatively well off.
Who are in the context of Jamaica, nobody looks at themselves as well off,
right.
But I have to look at the entire population. I can't just look at the people here who are, and the people you speak to, the people who write in newspapers, the people who have access to opinion leaders, the people who are, at the forefront of policy dialogue in Jamaica, who are all in that minority. I have to think about the vast majority of Jamaicans, who will never appear for the time being in a forum like this, who are below the threshold. And if it's going to be if it's not going to be revenue neutral, I can't make that allocation to a small group to that degree. So what we have to talk about is doing it in a revenue neutral way, and then we have to talk about, all right, what are the ways in which we're going to make it revenue neutral? And then another problem emerges, how we're going to make the measures that make the income tax adjustment revenue neutral. How are we going to protect the same people I'm concerned about, from the increases that would balance the income tax reduction. Now, these are not impossible questions, but those are the questions I believe that need to be asked. It can't be the idea of income tax, a massive income tax threshold that's non-revenue neutral, and you're taking up that pool of funds, right? In Jamaica, a country of many needs, and delivering that pool of funds to a small minority of the population is questionable. And so the better way would be to think about how we can do it in a revenue neutral, but then we'd be obligated to find ways to protect the vulnerable. And that is not an impossible thing to do. What we did back in 2017, 18, and 16, 17 was that the allocations to social spending went up by 50% in 1 year. Yeah, so what we'd have to do is absolutely front load social spending, massively increase path to make sure that if you have increases in other areas, it doesn't affect them. But you have to, that's not a debate I'm going to lead. That's something you're going to have to take on. So I see you with your points, but what I'm saying to you is you're looking at half the picture.
And I would like to sort of leave with the audience where you ended, which is that we look at equity not just in relation to the tax structure, but in relation to the entire budget, which means it would have to be socially balanced by increasing social expenditure, more to the PATH program, so that it ends up being not equity negative.
Right. And that's if you're going to do it in one jump. If you're going to do it over time, that's a different argument. But I'm saying if you're doing it in one jump and taking that massive pool and just giving it to that small segment of society, it would have to be revenue neutral if you're doing it in one go. And if you're doing it the way we did it the last time. If you did it over a period of many years, that's a different picture altogether.
Okay, so I want to turn the discussion to, the point where I started the presentation, which is this impressive, even on a global scale, reduction in debt. I mean, I don't know of any other country that, without defaulting on principle, has reduced public debt from 1.5 times GDP down to where investors don't worry about it, which is 60% of GDP, without defaulting on debt. As far as I know, this is the only country that has ever done it. But now that we are here, Ronaldo, who's in the audience, has a question. Can we get a microphone to him? That question came in on Slido. So please go to slido.com, put in the event code Capri, and your questions can appear in front of me.
Oh, thank you. Do you believe that once we dip below that 60% threshold that we should legislate a maximum threshold beyond which we cannot increase that, let's say 25%, and if we have to go over 25%, then it would require a supermajority vote in Parliament or something like that?
Well, I love that question coming from the next generation. So
do we amend the fiscal responsibility legislation with something more aggressive?
Right. So as we approach that 60% target, and remember, 60% is just a maximum. It doesn't mean that we must be at 60, right? These questions are going to be more pertinent, and these are questions that I think population needs to be and citizens need to be engaged in, not we telling you what it ought to be. What we can definitely say is that the successful small countries of the world all have small debt to GDPs. If you look at New Zealand, Estonia, Latvia, Ireland, Iceland, all of those countries that are successful and small, their debt to GDP ratios are in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 40s, right? So, and there's a reason for that. It is because when you are small, you are by definition, you don't have 50 industries contributing to export earnings. You have a few. We have probably 5 industries that account for more than 80% of our foreign exchange earnings, if you include remittances as an industry. Right? We have tourism, we have bauxite, we have agriculture in a good year, we have BPO, yeah? And then you have some agro-processing / manufacturing or something like that. So what it means is that your economy is not as diversified as the United Kingdom that might have 40 industries from, or the United States, electronics and semiconductors and Caterpillar trucks and pharmaceuticals and oil services and a plethora of industries, massively diversified. So they can take risks that a tiny country with a few industries cannot. Right? If we want to be able to survive the vagaries of life, because one thing we know about life is filled with ups and downs for the individual as it is for the country. And the key for small countries is to be able to recover quickly from those down cycles and get back up. To do so, the best remedy is to have low debt levels so that you have the policy flexibility to respond. So where we go after 60, I'm glad that we're starting a conversation now. I like the question that you asked. I am on record. At the start of this journey back in 2013, I had made the call when I was in the Senate for the fiscal rule to be put into the Constitution, right? So I'm more aligned with your kind of thinking, and I'm happy that you represent the future. Because we have shown that, first of all, it's taken us 30 years to pay off FinSat debt. Our debt to GDP was 74% prior to the FinSat crisis. And as the chart here showed, it's taken us 50 years to get back to 64%. When you lose it, it is hard to get it back. We see it with Barbados. Barbados had an investment grade rating. They had an investment grade rating, a credit rating that was A. They went all the way down to C. And from the time they were last at A to the time they get back, could well be, because already 11 years have gone. So, well, 2024, already 12 years have gone. So if I were to say it will take them a generation to get back, I would not be incorrect. Because today they're at 120, and so they still have a long way to go. So what we have seen is that when you lose your way on the debt trajectory, it takes a generation or 2 generations away. And because it has that degree of gravity, absolutely, more people have to be involved in the decision to blow the debt. It cannot just be left to a cabinet of 15 people. That's my view.
Okay, well, notwithstanding that view, we would like to know how is the government intending to continue being as aggressive with debt reduction, when we get past the 60% threshold? This is not an easy question to answer, or not a simple question to answer, because it has been argued that there might be greater economic and social returns to diverting paying down debt to other expenditures. I mean, to put it in quantitative terms, if you can get a greater economic return from a highway or a greater social return from building up the social safety net than the interest on the debt you are retiring, then it makes sense to keep the debt. So in that context, is the cabinet leaning towards continuing to being as aggressive, especially in light of the fact that 60% debt, is kind of that level where, as I indicated in the presentation, investors are not really so concerned anymore about the risk of indebtedness.
All right, so let me begin by commenting on something you said earlier. Jamaica's experience with debt reduction in the context of no default has no precedent. It is an incredible story that we in Jamaica underappreciate. There's nobody else in the world who has done what we have done. And Jamaica used to be known for sun and sand and sea and music. We are still known for those things. But today, Jamaica is known for the reform to its economy and for the performance to its economy. It's an incredible thing. It's incredible. Now, when you say reducing debt aggressively, again, I want to make it clear that Jamaica has fiscal rules, and the fiscal rules are such that maybe there's limited understanding of how they work, but how it works, is we have a debt target to get to at a particular year, 27, 28, and there's a formula embedded in the law, one of the few laws in Parliament that has a mathematical formula in it. And what that formula spits out, what you put into the formula is what your current debt is, what your interest rates are, what your other parameters, and it spits out the fiscal balance that ought to be targeted in that particular year. And fiscal balance is the difference between revenues and expenditure that ought to be targeted in that year. It puts your growth rate as well, clearly. That ought to be targeted in that year in order to meet the target by 2028. And then you're constrained to design your budget within that framework. Okay? It also says if you have a massive deviation from that fiscal balance that you ought to target, and that deviation is over 1.5% of GDP, you have 3 years to make it up. And you calculate that correction period at the beginning of the correction period, and you stick to it. Okay? And then when you get out of it, you start to calculate annually as well. Jamaica had a massive deviation in COVID because we were supposed to have a fiscal balance, I can't remember, but I think it was a fiscal surplus, and we ended up with a deficit of 3.1% of GDP, which is perfectly understandable. But the fiscal rules applied, so we escaped the fiscal rules, and then we went back in and calculated a correction period which called for a fiscal balance of 0.3%, 0.3% of GDP. And we were able to accomplish 0.9, 0.3, 0.04. Okay, so in this last year, it should have been 0.3, but it came out at 0.04. So in aggregate, we did the correction because the first year was over. So I say that to say that it's not that we are, by choice, sort of aggressively paying. What we're doing is we are committed to the law that we passed. We collectively passed, right? Which prescribes a fiscal balance, and that is what we are pursuing. Now, the results have since, went up to 110% after COVID, and the results have been definitely, we've gone faster than would have been anticipated, and so now we are ahead of our target, right? Because we have 2028 to get to 60%, and by 2025, we could be mid-60s. But, one thing that the government, we believe in, is in the value of having buffers. And buffers consist of many things. Having reserves in your central bank in the event of eventualities that interrupt the supply. Having funds in different places. You have your bauxite fund, it's called the Capital Development Fund. You have your natural disaster fund. You have your contingencies.
I'm going to interrupt your answer to ask the question that allows you to elaborate more on that, because that is one of the points I want to bring out. Before I do that, I would like you to go to slido.com. There's a poll question that I would like all of you here on online to participate in, because we are talking about what government should do with the dividend of debt reduction. And we'd like to know what you think. I want to put the debt reduction in the context in which you have put it, which is in increasing the country's resilience. A small, open economy is going to be subjected constantly to economic shocks, natural disasters, and so building up our resilience is a key part of our economic policy. So talk a bit more about, just enumerate for us everything that has been done in recent years that comes under the heading of fiscal and economic resilience, because that doesn't make headlines.
Okay. So when I became Minister of Finance, one of the very first speeches, I think it was the very first speech I made, I outlined the philosophical framework that would define policy making. And what I said at the time is that we're going to have a policy framework that prioritizes economic independence, economic opportunity for all, and protection of the vulnerable. And that is the framework that has guided policy over my time as minister. And the reason for that, here I'm focusing on the first objective, economic independence, is that my read of Jamaican economic history is that we often talk about, oh, growth over 40 years has been 1%, which is focusing on the mean, on the average. But the average, which is the first order, masks what is really happening, because that average of 1% conceals the fact that the variability around that average has been extreme. Jamaica's real problem over the last 50 years has not been the average. The real problem is the economic volatility that we have experienced around that average. And the economic volatility means you can't plan your short term, because you can't, you're not going to see into the future, because as soon as you're up, you go down. You're up, you go down. You go up, you go down. And there's no better way to see that than considering the fact that since we started measuring growth quarterly, 19 quarters of growth is the longest consecutive period of growth that we have had, which is 5 years, right? In the United States, their economic cycles are 10 years. The longest period has been of quarterly growth has been 19 quarters. The second longest period is the one that we are in now, in where we have gone, we're projected to be at 11 quarters post-COVID of economic increases, okay? When you look prior to this period, what you see is that we'd have 2 quarters of growth, 3 quarters of decline, 4 quarters of growth, 5 quarters of decline, 8 quarters of growth. The longest before this era was 9 quarters, 2.25 years of economic growth. Now, how can you develop if the longest stretch of growth that you can have is 2.25 years before, boom, you fall down again?
So what have we done?
And so that is my read of Jamaica's economic history, is the primary problem has been that economic volatility, up and down, up and down, up and down. And that is why we have prioritized economic resilience, which what economic resilience is putting yourself in a position that
gets no votes.
It's not necessarily.
No, resilient, because you have to explain it.
Yeah.
This is the political problem. Resilience gets no votes because history does not give you the benefit of its alternatives. So when you avoid a disaster, nobody notices. So this is why we want you to enumerate.
Correct. So we're gonna go through it. So resilience is that you're in a position that a little thing can't tip you over. Where we were before, the reason why we had that volatility is that you do that and Jamaica would fall down. All right? Any little breeze blow, we would fall over. Resilience is such that you're strong that you can't, them little tip, you have to really do a big push for you to fall over. Okay? And when you fall over, you can get back up quickly. When you do have resilience, you fall down and it takes you a long time to get up. Again, I want to give you the case in point that I've given many times before, that when the economy declined in 1976 due to
what was happening at the time, it declined in 76, 77, 79, 80, and it was not until 1989. Let's think about that. It wasn't until 1989 that we recovered to the levels in real terms that we were in 1975. It took us 14 years. More recently, in the global financial crisis, when the economy declined in 2008, declined in 2009, declined in 2010, it took us until 2019 to recover where we were prior to the crisis. Now we had the biggest test of all, biggest test economically in our history with the COVID decline. The decline in the global financial crisis was 3%. In 1976, it was 5%. In the COVID crisis, it was 10%. And what happened in COVID? We recovered, one of the quickest recoveries in the entire hemisphere. There are countries today that have still not attained their pre-COVID levels of economic output in real terms. Jamaica did it in record time. It was 2.5 to 3 years. And that is because we're increasing the level of resilience, which gives you the opportunity to bounce back. And that is what you need for development. Interrupted, punctuated development will get us nowhere. We have had that experience for 50 years. So what have we done to increase and improve resilience? One is that our debt is lower than before. And what that does is it gives you more flexibility, because debt introduces what we call rigidity. Right? Interest is something you have to pay. When the principal becomes due, you have to pay it. It becomes the first priority ahead of everything else. So if there's a crisis and you have a lot of debt, you don't have much to reduce. It's like your personal budget. What is it that you can reduce if you have a crisis, right? You can't reduce that. You only have this space to have your reduction. So what ends up happening is that the vulnerable suffer and your priority programs get delayed. When you have lower debt, if there's a crisis, you have more space to adjust. It'll still be tough, but it won't be what it was before. The second thing we've done is to increase the reserves in our central bank. The reserves in our central bank was $2 billion in 2016. And $800 million of those reserves were borrowed CDs. Today, our reserves are $5 billion US, with $80 million of borrowed CDs. By increasing our reserves, by more than doubling our foreign exchange reserves, it gives us more resilience, because if we are a country that depends on Jamaican dollars, all that we have. But we have to trade with the outside world. You can't trade with the outside world with Jamaican dollars. So to be resilient, you have to be in a position that if there's an interruption in the flow of foreign exchange, you can survive. Nobody believed that Jamaica could do without tourism for 18 months. For 18 months, not $1 of tourism revenue came into Jamaica. We underestimate what resilience has meant for our country. We are able to survive that because at the time we had $4 billion of reserves in the central bank. We have also, for resilience, put in place a suite of financial instruments that provide fiscal resources in the event of a natural disaster crisis. We have a catastrophe bond, we just renewed it, that would provide $24 billion, or if there's a massive direct hit, clearly the payout is related to the intensity of the hit and the path of the hurricane. But we also have a contingent credit claim with the IDB where we can draw down immediately. We have the CRIF, Caribbean Catastrophe Reinsurance Facility. We have a legislation in Parliament to create a natural disaster fund to which we're obligated to save every year. We put $4.5 billion away in our contingencies fund. This year we're putting $1 billion away in the natural disaster fund. So we're putting money away, right? A priori.
And Jamaican dollar international debt.
Yeah, I'm coming to that, yes. Putting funds away to deal with the certainty of natural disaster at some point. That increases resilience, because what you don't want in a natural disaster, emergency expenses have to be paid no matter what. I'll never forget in COVID, the example I give is that the plane was in the air on the willow trees for, you know the Gilbert plane in the willow trees? Anybody? Okay. It was in that willow tree for what seemed like months because it was not an emergency. Yeah? It wasn't an emergency. The emergency expenditures, though, if the roof blow off of the hospital, you have to find the money to pay for it. If the bridge between two communities goes, you must deal with it immediately. And it is those emergency expenditures that can throw a government off. So we have put together the resources, our own savings, along with financial instruments that can pay out in the event of a natural disaster. We have issued for the very first time in November something that was inconceivable only a few years ago, a Jamaican dollar bond in international capital markets. This is investors in New York and London and California and in Zurich and Belgium, Antwerp, lending to Jamaica in Jamaican dollars, taking on Jamaican dollar risk. Absolutely inconceivable just 3 or 4 years ago. That is a result of the reforms that we've implemented, and in particular, the central bank independence, where the central bank has the legal mandate and the flexibility and the tools to target inflation. Our debt mix today is 60% foreign debt, 60% US dollar, sorry. Of our debt today is 60% denominated in foreign currency and 40% denominated in Jamaican dollars. That's an exposure. Resilience means changing that mix over time. Just like we did the total debt from 147 down now to 72. What we want to do is to go from 60-40 to 55-45 to 50-50 to 45-55 to 40-60 to 30-70. That's going to get there, obviously it's going to take several years. But we have made the start, and that makes us more resilient. Because in the event of disturbances, the fact that your debt is denominated in your own currency gives you policy choices to respond to those. And there are others, but I'm going to, in the interest of time. So resilience, economic independence has been a policy priority of the government. And I've just shared with you 5, 6 things, big things that we have done to increase the resilience of Jamaica in order to assure our sort of what I'd call uninterrupted development, to give us a chance to get out of the stop and start cycle that has been a feature of the last 50 years.
I want to turn attention now to the question that Capri has raised in the presentation is one of the most important policy questions we face at this particular juncture. And you yourself earlier mentioned its importance. How do we collectively decide what we do with the dividend, the additional revenue that is coming from the improved policy environment and the improved economy? And on Slido, David Walters is asking if it is a collective decision. How do we participate in determining this? Where is the channel? And this is particularly important because one of Capri's regular reports is one called Following the Money, where we look at not the budget numbers, but the budget process. Participation, oversight, transparency. And you will recall, Minister, that the one area where Jamaica scored poorly is in citizen participation in the budget process. So now that you've invited citizens to participate, what are the channels through which we do so? And while you think about that, I'm going to show you the answers. We went and asked some of our citizens, how should government spend additional resources? And we got some answers. So let's have a look at that.
Yeah, in the country, government really need to spend more money and time on the crime and violence because it really a whole body country in a certain sense. You understand? So the crime and violence need to take more time out in that and spend more money upon that. Different from the roads, the local roads, not about the highways, you know, the local roads, they carry me home, coming to live on highway. Yeah, so that and the crime and the violence, more money needs and time. I have to spend more time in it and money.
Yeah, the government need to spend more money on the school, on the education sectors. Yeah. The youth them want more information and more skills. So them need more things to start employ the youth them and inspire the youth them. And the next thing too, the hospital them want deal with and take care. Because you go up a Capri, you go up a Spanish Town, you have to wait. You go over all children, you have to wait. So the government need to spend money on them two sectors that we need. Education and the hospital.
So it's, you know, Jamaica is a real country, right? You cannot spend $1 that's not approved by Parliament. If tomorrow morning we decide that we want to do so, I have to go back to Parliament and get their approval. Anybody involved in the budget process, you earn a tremendous amount of respect for our little country. The process, I'd say to you, Damien, everybody, you're kind of looking for this sort of neat and explicit process. No,
Yes.
it's not like the process is one. Democracy is not that. Democracy is contended voices, and you know, it's not neat. There's nothing neat about democracy, unfortunately. Right? When you're talking about free people. And so how it happens, I would say to you, is that parliamentarians are, for the most part, in touch with their constituencies. They interact on a regular basis through a variety of modalities in ways that are not fully understood nor appreciated. Right? As somebody who was on your side, and I'm now firmly in the political arena, I can definitely say that, right? It's not fully appreciated. And that process is like a process of osmosis. You understand the priorities of the people, not you as a single individual, but you as 63 people making up the parliament. When you listen to the debates during the national budget debate, the sectoral debates, the parliamentary debates, you can easily form a picture of the concerns of people. That's one way, okay? And you listen to talk shows, you read polls. I mean, information comes through a variety of means. Look at what we're doing this year with the Spark program. Never been done before. Announced it last year, a massive intervention for roads. That is, I mean, something that I have made the allocation for. That is a direct response to what we hear. I sat through the parliamentary debates 2 years ago, and every single person who spoke on both sides mentioned the condition of people's roads. It was nauseating after a time, right? When I'm in Standing Finance Committee, parliamentarians on both sides, roads, roads, roads. When I go out in the community. So what did we do? We responded to that in a way that we have never done before, and we are coming up with a Spark program to have an intervention. 1 year can't fix it, right? But to have an intervention in a visible way to improve the quality of our roads. I'd say to you, this year, we have money in the budget for 4 hospitals at the same time. You go back to the 2010s, the 1990s, the 1980s, we've never had a period where we are either building new or refurbishing 4 new hospitals at the same time. Spanish Town, Western Adolescents, Cornwall, and the 4th one is UE, okay, the multi-story hospital. That is a direct response to what we hear from people, what we pick up, right? So my answer to you is that Jamaica, sometimes this demographic group underweights the contribution from other segments of the society. And because you're not a part of that conversation, you believe that it's not happening. You believe that people aren't transmitting. And that is something we have to get over. Something we really have to get over. I would say this demographic doesn't, if I were to be broad, doesn't, I don't want to make something that people find offensive, but this demographic to me can do a lot more in understanding the realities of Jamaica and how it functions actually. Yeah? And I'm saying to you, a lot of information is picked up through those processes, through those engagements. Some of them are very formal in terms of constituency development meetings. Some of them are very informal. You go to a funeral service or you participate in some event in a community. So what you see in a budget ultimately represents certainly our view of what people want. It's a democrat. Why would we put forward a budget people don't want? It wouldn't make any sense. So I'm saying to you that the process is not the kind of neat process that organized groups would dominate. And we can understand why organized groups want it that way. The process is a true democratic process that happens through a variety of modalities that are competing with each other and that are, in some ways not even, it's difficult to put on a piece of paper. But every program, all the programs that we have are responding to what we hear from constituents, from citizens, from interactions like these, and they find their way ultimately from parliamentary debates. They find their way, they express themselves in a national budget.
Minister, because we appreciate that you worked overtime today because you're here after hours. I don't know if ministers get overtime pay, but in appreciation for that, we're going to help you with one of those channels to find out what people really want, because we asked that question in the Slido poll. So we're going to see now what the persons who participate in Capri events thinks should be the priorities. Okay, so the poll question says, government revenue is rising. What do you think it should be spent on? And the categories are the poor, improved roads, reliable running water, arts, culture, and sports. And arts, culture, and sports got 13%. Reliable running water, 13%. Improved roads, 7%. The poor, 33%. Did I miss one? Yes. Arts, culture, the poor, 33%. So there seems to be, no. Oh, I see, okay. And crime reduction. I didn't scroll. Crime reduction, 34%. So there you have your priorities.
Yes, so let me just say something that is, whenever I hear like revenues are rising, I get a little, because don't oversell it, yeah?
You're the one that said it's going up.
No, it is, yeah? It is.
I'm just a messenger.
No, but I'm saying it is, okay? But what we don't want to do is to sort of create an impression that we have arrived. The adjustment that Jamaica went under to rehabilitate our fiscal accounts, the public sector was a major contributor to that. Real wages in the public service declined over a 10-year period. I believe the number would have been, 60% of what it was at the beginning of the 10-year period. And so one of the first returns that had to be made was to address that, but address that in a way that would lead to additional productivity. So everybody knows that public sector wage bill went up considerably, and that is where sort of the first, not the first, but a big part of the dividends so far have gone. Yeah. In terms of what was mentioned in your poll, all legitimate, no surprises there, and we're focused on delivery in all of those areas. And your process of providing feedback is one that's legitimate and one that I take seriously. And, you know, you can look out for the priorities that you mentioned to be factored in and featured as we go on. The fact that we actually moved the threshold from 1.5 to 1.7, we listened to you. I was here last year, you mentioned it. So the democratic process, what we're doing is how it works. It's ultimate, it's how it works, right? That is not, we are responding to the people, but we have to be careful. We have to respond to all the people, yeah? Because we are put there by all the people.
Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to invite Kim to take us out.
Fantastic. Thank you, Minister Clark and Dr. King, for such a rich and insightful and impassioned discussion. Dr. Clark, we would like to commend you for your willingness to consistently engage with Capri, our reports, and the Jamaican people. Even though sometimes we may not see eye to eye on all issues, we appreciate your resilience, your commitment, and transparency to dialogical engagement, and they're very much valued and appreciated. As a reminder, you can find the full report of the budget breakdown online on our website at www.capricaribbean.org for download. On behalf of the whole Capri team, I would like to acknowledge and thank the Rock Hotel for hosting us here today, as well as all of our Gold sponsor members. So our Gold sponsor members are the good corporate citizens that support Capri's work in the public interest throughout the year, and without whom our work would not be possible. So our Gold sponsor members include University of the West Indies, Jamaica National, Pan Jam Investments, JMMB Group, VM Group, Continental Baking Company, Stewart's Automotive Group, Wasinco Group, Jamaica Producers, Cable and Wireless, Restaurants of Jamaica, KFC and Pizza Hut, and NCB. If you, whether as an individual or a corporate entity, consider our work to be important and valuable and would like to be a part of helping us to make that happen, let us know by chatting with us after the event is over. Our next report launch, which is a strategic evaluation of Jamaica's Zones of Special Operation, or ZOZOs, is slated for the end of this month. So definitely stay tuned to our social media channels for more information on that. Thank you all again for being such an engaged audience and for joining us this evening. For those of you here with us in downtown Kingston at the wonderful Rock Hotel, please do stay with us for some dialogical engagement, which is a fancy word for having very meaningful discussions about important conversations like we've done today, on the pool deck just outside of this room. I'm sure that we all have a lot to discuss after such a generative conversation, so myself and the Capri team look forward to meeting you all out there. Thank you again, have a great evening, and take care.